Is everyone hearing me okay? Yes. All right, awesome. So my name is Brandy Simonson, and I'm one of the co-directors of the center, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Tracy and Mike, who are going to talk with all of us, for the next roughly hour and 15 minutes about how to integrate academic and behavior support. So just so we have a sense of who's in the room, and you can raise your hand multiple times through these questions. How many of you are currently classroom-based educators? A few. How many of you are in positions where you're directly supporting, coaching, training classroom-based educators? Almost everybody. How many of you are currently, like your title includes coach, interventionist? Awesome. How many of you are administrators? Many. How many of you work at the school level? How many of you may support schools, but you work at the district level? And how many of you support districts, but you work at the state or higher ed or some other level that I didn't already mention? Awesome. So we are going to try and meet all of those audiences in this presentation. We are going to invite you to ask questions, but we are going to potentially respond with, hang on to that because we're going to come back to it later. We may also ask for some questions to be conversations after the session just to keep us moving because we have a lot of awesome resources to share with you. And my job is to set us up. So the conversation we're going to have while I'm up here is, what do we mean when we talk about an integrated continuum of support? So is there anyone that already has a really coherent, clear, and evidence-based answer to that question? So I was hoping to just hand the mic over and sit down. So this is something that is still a work in progress, I think, for us as a field. We sometimes talk about it as though we know what it looks like, and we're still learning. So that's part of the conversation. We're going to talk about resources that help us support an integrated MTSS, and we're going to have Mike share a little bit about practices and Tracy share a lot about systems. So before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge that we're up here as the mouthpieces for a large team at the University of Connecticut that includes our colleagues and our doctoral students, some of whom are in the audience in the back. And so we wouldn't be able to do this work without a team. So as everything in PBIS and MTSS, it is a team sport. So we're going to start the conversation with the why. Why do we do this and what does it look like? Again, the ongoing conversation of what it looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like in a classroom. So we're going to actually get into the weeds, and Mike is going to demonstrate what it might look like to integrate behavior supports into an early reading lesson. So you'll have examples of exactly what we mean when we talk about this at the practice level. And then perhaps most importantly, Tracy is going to talk about how. So we have been doing this work conceptually for a very long time, but we are right now in, and I'm going to mess up the number, almost 200 schools, or almost 200 classrooms, not 200 schools, that would be crazy. Almost 200 classrooms supporting teachers in doing integrated work. So Mike will come back at the end to answer the question of, does it work? So we have some very preliminary data to show you. And for folks, were any of you with us last year when we introduced this? We kind of said, stay tuned, data will be coming. More data is still coming, but we have some to share this year. Okay. So starting us off with the why. Hopefully this is kind of a no-brainer, but just in case, we wanted to talk about what we mean and why. So we are part of an integrated multi-tiered systems of support research network, which is a mouthful, the IMTSS Research Network. And we have come together to talk about the core features of integrated MTSS. And for all of us that live and breathe in a community of PBIS, none of that should look unfamiliar. That is 100% the core features of PBIS. So many of us have feet in both worlds, and we borrowed a lot of the learning we have for systems, and we partnered with the deep expertise of our academic colleagues to refine what we actually mean by each of these pieces. But I just want to point out that there's really only one dot point, the first one, that is about practices. So although we're going to give you some examples of practices, most of the magic of integration is the data and the systems. So just kind of, again, putting that in context. While I just said that, we're going to dive for a second into the practice conversation. So how many of you are familiar with the idea of academic and behavior supports in a triangle framework? Please tell me this is everybody. Okay, good. So I think there's a simplistic way that we have talked and thought about what it looks like to integrate, and we've created that simplistic way. And so the basic idea is we just put it all in the same triangle, right? We just do 3 tiers and we put it all together. And I think that's somewhat true. I think our teaming structures, that's true. But if you think about students, it's not that we have kids that fit in triangles, right, ever. We have needs that fit in triangles. We have supports that fit in triangles. So I was having a conversation with some of our colleagues in the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and they made this really brilliant point, and we stole it and made it into a graphic, but the point comes from them. And their point was, there are some kids who are going to benefit from just integrated Tier 1. If their teachers are doing a really nice job with evidence-based academic instruction and evidence-based social, emotional, and behavioral support, there are about 80% of kids who are going to benefit with those supports alone. Some kids are going to benefit from universal or Tier 1 academic support, but they may need Tier 2 behavior support or social, emotional, behavioral supports layered on top of Tier 1 social, emotional, behavioral supports. And a few kids are going to benefit from Tier 1 academic, but they're going to need Tier 3 social, emotional, and behavioral supports layered on top of Tier 2 and Tier 1. There's also kids who are going to benefit from just our Tier 1 social, emotional, behavioral supports. But they may need targeted academic, and other kids might need intensive academic. You guys still with me? Okay. And then there are kids who have targeted needs in both areas and need truly integrated Tier 2. And there are kids, like the students I used to support, that have truly intensive needs in both areas, and they need truly integrated Tier 3 supports. And as we were talking through this conversation, like this is even a simple picture, because you notice we use the words behavior and academic, but we know behavior includes social, emotional, behavioral, mental health, and academic includes reading, math, and we could keep going, right? So this becomes like a 3-dimensional picture moving through space if we're actually thinking about all the different ways and configurations of need, which means we have to have really responsive systems and use data in a pretty nuanced way to make decisions about how to support all learners. In our research, we're kind of trying to go up the diagonal. We're looking for students who are benefiting from integrated Tier 1. We're looking for students and understanding what it means and the benefits when we integrate at Tier 2. And we're looking for students who have both levels of need in Tier 3 and looking at the impacts of integrated Tier 3. So today we're going to share a lot of information about Tier 1 because that's where we have data right now. But we are developing resources across all 3 tiers, and we are launching our Tier 2 adventures next month. Like, that's coming soon. So again, this is kind of our focus, but all of us have to think about all of those pieces. So the next question is why? Why can't we kind of keep doing business as usual? So I'm going to not answer for a second. Take 30 seconds. You can either think to yourself if you don't want to talk right now, or lean over and chat quickly with a friend about why we need to be talking about integrating these supports. All right, coming back together. So I had said 30 seconds, but y'all were so engaged, and I realized that could have been like a whole hour conversation. But what were a couple of the reasons that came up in a very short sentence about why it is important to integrate? Yeah.
Save time, be a little more efficient.
Yeah. So it'll save time, it allows you to be more efficient. Manpower. So how many of you had conversations about time or resources being a good reason? Were there other reasons that came up as you were talking? Yeah. I could pay you right now. That is like the most brilliant entry into the next conversation. Because a big part of it is about efficiency, it's about time and resources, but it's also about the kids, right? It's that we don't know necessarily what's causing what, but we know there are relationships between academic and behavioral needs, academic and behavioral outcomes, and optimistically, academic and behavioral improvement, right? If we can help a kid develop skills in either area, it benefits both. But if we help them develop skills in both areas, it benefits everything. So kids don't come often with only one level of need, and even if they do at the beginning, they often develop the other area of need, right? Because they may use behavior to escape academics, or their behavior may pull them out of instruction, so even though they were benefiting from instruction originally, they miss some. So there is a quick resource from the center on academic instruction as a protective factor. And we wrote this because we were seeing coming out of the pandemic that many schools were so prioritizing social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health supports, which was critical. But some of them were forgetting that good routines, including engaging supportive instruction, is also a social, emotional, behavioral support. So we wanted to help remind folks of the importance of that connection. The other reason, which maybe if I had given a little more time we would have heard, is it might work, right? It may be more efficient, it makes sense, but it may actually result in better outcomes. So right now, we have decent amounts of research on PBIS. We talked about this morning, it's one of the more evidence-based multi-tiered frameworks that exists. We are very confident that when schools implement with fidelity, kids can experience positive outcomes. If the school is also implementing effective academic instruction, we see academic growth. Because getting social, emotional, behavioral needs supported allows kids the space, time, energy to access instruction. But if the instruction is not fantastic, we may not see academic outcomes even if their other needs are taken care of. On the reading side, or math side, there is a lot of emerging evidence for reading specifically in using multi-tiered supports. There is less evidence on how that impacts behavior, not necessarily because it doesn't, it just hasn't been measured. So that is right now a question mark. It may have a huge impact, but we haven't directly measured that as a field. And so we're really excited about the possibility of integrating and being able to show meaningful outcomes. There is shockingly little research that actually proves that's true. And I say shocking because how many of you are in states that have integrated language and multi-tiered systems of support language in your state policies, procedures that flow down to districts, that flow down to schools? How many? So not a ton of you raised your hand, but if you actually looked at some of the state regs across the country, and I'm spacing the number, it's way more than I thought, given the state of the research. So we think it's promising, we're really excited about it, but we're trying to ramp up the research so we know what we're doing as we're recommending that schools do it. So I'm gonna set us up very fast with the what for behavior. So when we're talking about integrating evidence-based practices in the classroom, hopefully this is all common and familiar to you, because I'm going to do it the fast way. There are organizations like the Council for Exceptional Children, which is our professional organization if you're in the field of special education, that have looked for those practices that are most likely to turn the dial for student outcomes. And they call those high leverage practices. So in other places, they're called evidence-based. There's different words we use. The CEC has identified 22 individual practices. My animation broke. But we grouped those into several kind of key areas. So for us, when we're talking about high leverage practices in the classroom, we're talking about ways that we teach content explicitly. And since I'm the one up here right now, how we teach social, emotional, behavioral skills explicitly. We think about ways that we actively engage kids in instruction. So when I'm up here talking from a behavioral perspective, I'm still talking about engaging academic instruction. We think about ways we set kids up for success. We prompt them before something happens. We provide specific positive feedback, at least a 5-to-1 ratio, The best research we have right now says 5-to-1 is supportive of many learners. For kids at risk of emotional or behavioral disorders, so kids with higher levels of risk, we get to the 9-to-1. So both of the ratios Lucille mentioned in her keynote are accurate. They're just different for different populations. So the more intense the need, the more positive a kid needs us to be. And we also use data to monitor and adjust. So to save me a little time, I'm going to remind you that the center has fantastic resources on this. So the supporting and responding to students' social, emotional, and behavioral needs is our go-to resource for classroom PBIS. It talks about the foundational practices, how we actively engage kids in PBIS practices or with PBIS practices during instruction. The next columns go into how do we monitor fidelity and how do we use their outcomes to guide our decisions. So in this practice, or in this guide, we talk explicitly about how to implement those high leverage practices that just came up. And every one of those white boxes links to a table with what it looks like, sounds like. It cites research, and it gives examples that are clicks to videos and podcasts. So if you haven't seen and used this resource, it is worth your time. Another resource that's a quick cheat is there is a classroom designing effective environments template is what it's called. We borrowed this and used it in our research, so you're going to see it in a second filled in. But this is available as a Word doc to download and modify on your own. It's up on pbis.org under the classroom resources. And it again asks teachers to think about how to plan those exact same high leverage practices. And I'm now going to turn us over to Mike to talk about what do these same exact practices look like with a focus on reading and then integrated implementation.
Great, thank you so much. It's so great to get to be here with you all today. And I have to say, as a reading person, I always feel extra special when I'm invited to hang out with behavior folks, because you guys are definitely the cool crowd. So I'm really happy to be here, and you guys also definitely have the funnest conferences too. So I'll come to this whenever I can. It's also been a real honor and opportunity to get to work with Brandy and Tracy and the rest of our UConn team on the integrated MTSS project. It's been a really great collaboration. My job, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about what effective practices look like in reading. And then, like Brandy said, get in the weeds a little bit of how we developed this kind of integrated reading behavior classroom supports by looking at what we've sort of designed as part of this study. So good reading instruction looks a lot like good PBIS instruction. And these same high leverage practices or high leverage features are the same across supporting behavior and supporting reading, right? So teaching explicitly, prompting, using data, actively engaging students, opportunities to respond, positive feedback and error correction. And we kind of, in reading, oftentimes think about these as, general features or principles of explicit instruction or effective instruction. So these are all the stuff, all the things that we try to think about in reading also. And so, just briefly, when we think about reading instruction, we think about what to teach. So those are essential reading skills and strategies. And then we also think about how to teach. And that's kind of what we were talking about just now, right? These principles or features of effective instruction, explicit instruction. And in reading, we oftentimes want to try to rely on high quality instructional tools and materials, programs or platforms. And there's a reason for that. One is, and I think it's because these kinds of features are already built in and baked into the architecture of high quality tools and materials, right? So these kinds of programs have systematic scope and sequences that really carefully schedule and structure introduction of critical reading skills and strategies, and also the architecture of these, the instructional design of high quality instructional tools, really focuses and emphasizes helping teachers provide explicit and effective instruction on sort of how we teach. So for our integrated project, we decided, or we chose Enhanced Core Reading Instruction, or ECRI, as our sort of foundational reading platform or program that we're using to develop this integrated approach in our study. How many of you are familiar with ECRI? Anybody? Yeah, all right. So we chose this because one, it has extensive evidence of effectiveness and a number of really high quality research studies. It also targets really essential foundational reading skills designed for kids in K3 or so. It also is designed to be used in Tier 1 whole class instruction. But it also is appropriate and is designed for Tier 2 small group intervention. And I would say it would work for Tier 3 individualized intervention with the right kind of modifications and problem and accommodations. So ECRI is a series of about 10 short reading routines that again focus on these foundational reading skills, designed for Tier 1 to be implemented in whole class instruction for about 30 minutes. And again, in Tier 2, it would be small group instruction for about the same amount of time. So we are using that as our kind of platform for coming up with what this integrated practice, integrated instruction looks like. Okay, so our goal was we want to integrate effective classroom PBIS practices with effective classroom reading instruction. Right, that's easy to say and do. We even have this kind of fancy conceptual frameworky thing over here. But what does that really look like in practice? And I don't know about you, but a lot of times it feels like when we talk about what this looks like, we talk about it more in these kind of broad, vague, general terms. So I know that in reading, reading folks tend to say things like, don't forget to use your PBIS strategies when you're teaching reading. And then maybe you behavior folks say, don't forget that good reading instruction also supports behavior. And so these is sort of like, we know that this integration in practice is important, but we're not really, we're sort of giving you general advice on how to do that. So our goal was to come up with something much more sort of intentional and really design materials that would help teachers, systematically integrate this in an intentional, thoughtful way. So what we did is we developed a sort of classroom integrated instructional lesson template that included these features. It starts out with behavior prompts. So this is teaching and reminding students what it looks like to be engaged during reading instruction in Tier 1. Then we have these integrated reading routines that we started with the ECRI routines, and we embedded explicit behavior prompts, praise, and correction. And then we incorporated a kind of group reinforcement student-teacher game kind of throughout. So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit and give you a sense of what this looks like. All right, so we developed some slides for teachers to use at the beginning of each daily lesson, and they were able to customize this based on their school. So this was like, again, connecting back to their universal expectations for school. So we might, and then we had the student-teacher game. So they might say, just like your school's mascot, we could be respectful and responsible during reading instruction. You might want to say, like Jonathan the Yukon Husky is respectful and responsible. Go Yukon, right? We saw Rebecca Lobo at the airport yesterday, who's a famous Yukon women's basketball star. So with some excitement in the airport yesterday for us UConn fans. And then, provide some examples and non-examples of what that looks like during reading instruction. And at the beginning, there was a little bit more intentional teaching that took longer, and then throughout the year, there was more just kind of prompting and reminding and reteaching as needed. And then also setting up some goals for a contingency. So the next thing was the integrated reading routines, and this is where we kind of started with the ECRI routines, which pretty much any kind of reading intervention program or instructional program for each kind of component starts off with modeling or explanation, then practices for students and potentially group responses, and then some individual check for understanding, so individual turns. What we did is we explicitly and intentionally incorporated behavior-specific praise and then behavior-specific praise and correction for each of these steps. And so I'm going to take just a few minutes to show you what this looks like. This is what like an ECRI routine looks like. And this is one that takes about 5 minutes, and it's looking at letter sounds. So what the ECRI routine by itself says is, it sort of has some modeling, and then we're going to practice these letter sounds. But what we did is we built in these specific behavior-specific prompts and praise that teachers could use sort of as they're introducing and responding to students during this. So the teacher might say, you're going to practice saying sounds. When I point to a letter, say the sound in your head. When I touch under the letter, say the sound out loud as long as I touch under the letter. And this is new. We added this. I'll show you how to say the sounds for the first 2 letters. Respectfully listen by waiting your turn. My turn. Sound. Okay, remember, when it's my turn, voices are off. So let's try that again. It's my turn. I don't think I heard anybody, just in case I heard someone. My turn. Sound. Sound. D. Okay. Nice job listening, respectfully waiting for your turn. Then there's group turns. Now I'm going to point to a letter and say the sounds in your head when I touch under the letter. Say the sound out loud as long as I touch under the letter. And we add some behavior-specific praise and correction. So now it's your turn. Sound. 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 I love how I heard everyone say the sounds together, right? But if I heard some people not quite chiming in unison, I might say, remember, I want to hear everyone say the sounds together. Let's try that again. And then it goes on for individual turns. It does the same thing. And then at the end, we sort of say, great job saying the sounds in words. We earned a point toward something that comes at the end of the 30 minutes. And then we sort of get a point for that. So that happens for each of these sort of 10 routines in the ECRI platform. And then we also kind of built in, we have sort of these scripted in praises and prompts, but we also kind of gave a checklist or a menu of other possible ways that teachers could respond that was a little bit more tailored to what they might expect to see. This is, I think, I'm not going to go through this in small, but this is in the handouts. And then finally, we have the student-teacher game at the end, and that's just, it's fun to be respectful and responsible. Today's goal was a zillion points, and we earned a zillion points. So if we met our goal, we could choose or earn some of these kind of class, really quick little reinforcements. So that is kind of what our integrated instruction looks like in Tier 1. Again, these are classroom teachers doing this with whole classes for about 30 minutes. But just before I turn it over to Tracy, I want to tell you a little bit about kind of what this might look like in Tier 2 and Tier 3. So in Tier 2, we're pretty much using these same routines. So the ECRI routines with embedded behavior supports, because ECRI is actually designed to pre-teach essential content that's happening in Tier 1 during Tier 2. So we're going to be doing in schools where the small group of students who are identified for needing targeted reading supports get the same lesson ahead of time as the whole class, but they get it before and in small groups. And for behavior supports, we're intensifying those supports, so there's a little bit more direct teaching of social skills that might be appropriate or helpful for how kids can be successful in small group or whole group. And then maybe for some kids, a check-in, check-out component is added. In Tier 3, I would say that a similar kind of intensive intervention approach like this was a really good kind of start for data-based individualization. So starting with this, but maybe the scope and sequence is more individualized for the student, that some activities are emphasized more than others, that we're making decisions based on data. But one of the really things that I think is a strength of ECRI is it's the same kind of platform and language and principles of explicit instruction that students can hear across tiers. So they're not kind of shifting languages and approaches from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3. Okay, so that's what our integrated practice looks like in Tier 1. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tracy that's going to talk about how we help schools and teachers to do this.
Thank you. I'm reminded of, I don't know if any of you have listened to Kent McIntosh talk about his equity content and vulnerable decision points, and one of his examples being that if you go before a judge right before lunch break, you might have a little harsher outcome than if you're earlier in the day. So, just tuck that back and have a strategy for that feeling of, I'm still going to focus because maybe you have a great lunch coming, but think about this. So happy to be, even later and closer to your lunch break. But thank you for being here. All right, so the how, the details, the weeds is where we're at. Okay, so Mike just talked about materials, and I remember when I spend most of my professional life has been around the training and coaching, and when I started as the Hill for Literacy partner on the UConn team, Mike told me, well, it's really all about the materials, as I'm slaving away on training and coaching, but it's obviously really all three. No point in training on materials that don't have evidence base, aren't effective, don't fit those features of effective instruction. So these all go together. And mine is the training and the coaching to share with you. And again, lots of other people who are in on all of this great stuff. I'm peeked ahead, I was looking at my own agenda, and at 2:30 I'm going to another coaching breakout, and their description started with, training is an event and coaching is what connects those events. I said, well, that's a great start, and I jotted that down. So good for me for looking ahead and connecting our things. All right, hands up, wave if you've heard of Anita Archer. Woohoo, right? Awesome in terms of, actually this is gonna sound nerdy, Sunday I'm listening to the Teach by Design podcast, I really was, and Kent McIntosh happened to be on there and also mentioned Anita Archer, and about how she said, if you don't explicitly teach what you expect, you are at risk of assumpticide in terms of assuming that you're going to get what you want, but you really haven't explicitly taught it, which Mike also just mentioned for the reading, and that we don't typically give enough practice. We all know the I do, we do, you do, but often in reality and time crunch, we go right from the I do to the you do. And then some of those are practicing incorrect, whatever it is you're looking for, whether it's behavior or a reading skill. So a lot of emphasis came from that, and we framed the training for teachers around that, linking the two together. This is probably relatively small print, but this is just an example of effective instruction for reading, that planning, what have my students mastered, where do we move now, again, with that already well-articulated evidence-based scope and sequence of a good program that Mike mentioned. All right, so we've been blending words with sounds that you can hold. When Mike held his finger longer, that was a hold sound. I know that now because I've integrated myself, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So now we're going to practice blending words that have a stop sound at the beginning. Watch me, modeling. Modeling is built into the ECRI. Modeling is certainly a principle of effective positive behavior supports as well. Guided, okay, now it's your turn, blend on my signal, I'm listening, I'm monitoring, I'm giving corrective feedback, I'm having it do it again so that we hear it correctly more than incorrectly. And then the review for you do. Later, you're gonna continue practicing blending that have a stop sound at the beginning when it's your turn to read with a partner. Pretty basic. Not revolutionary. No one's going, aha, I got to write that down, because we all got this in all those hands. I have to say I'm humbled here. The amount of knowledge and experience in this building is mind-blowing. So I'm going to say mind-blowing, not intimidating, but my head's going either way. All right, so we can say the same for behavior, right? Simple example, but this is the logic, the I do, we do, you do, Anita Archer. Effective instruction strategies. My students are doing well with showing respect and whole group on the rug, but centers are too loud and they are not staying in their assigned center. How will I adjust? Again, this morning we heard all about this. How are we guiding the adult behavior to better support the students? All right, I'm reading these to you because they're pretty small. I'm thinking in the back, you're probably squinting away. I don't read slides if I'm pretty sure you can see them. We've been showing respect on the rug with quiet voices, staying in our assigned spot. Watch me use a quiet voice in the word center and wait for the chimes to move to my next center. Jonah, will you be the teacher and ring the chimes? We do it together, just practicing the behavior, not worrying about doing the center activity, but let's focus on the behavior that we need to be successful in that academic situation that we're going to have shortly. Let's all go to our first center and role play quiet voices. When you hear the chimes, show how you move to the next center. So they're not doing anything in the center, they're just practicing that routine. You do during centers today. I am listening for quiet voices and watching for everyone to stay in their center until we hear the chimes. Let's earn a paw print for respect during centers. Then the teacher would go on to focus their feedback on that. So again, we just draw this connection for teachers because, again, and Mike even mentioned it too, it's like, we give these broad terms, do this, to all those frontline people that are doing a million things in any given moment, but what's it really look like and being explicit? So the example and the model of this, teachers in the training certainly understood that they weren't only doing this in their half hour of ECRI a day, that this is something that was generalizable across their whole day. And schools were in various stages of PBIS implementation, so that it wasn't brand new. So we use the classroom matrix, which Brandy pointed out in the classroom support plan, had actual lesson plans to teach the expectations within, right? When you look at your matrix, what's it look like when I'm doing ECRI? That's different than if I'm doing math. It's different if I'm working on my own. And again, the prompts and behavior feedback were implemented right into the lessons. And then high rates of specific praise for demonstrations of the behavior and a class-wide acknowledgement system. Again, for the study, we only required it for during that ECRI time, but many teachers and the coaching would kind of, gee, if you want, go ahead and spread it across. All right, classroom PBIS really framed this, that this is not, there really was nothing on this list that we thought teachers hadn't heard of. What really makes the difference is using them effectively and at the frequency and intensity and specific phrasing to really get the biggest evidence-based outcomes for them. So it was really about how are we doing this and how are we doing it as well as possible to impact outcomes as much as we can. I told them I needed my notes, and I haven't looked at them yet, so, but that's okay. Okay. So we shared and then we would share each of these elements with their critical features in the broad sense, but then in the context of the ECRI. And Brandy loves color coding, so when you see that little salmon color, that's the ECRI specific examples, like here. Little closer view, we did provide what we called a generic plan with all of the components that teachers could use. Our examples all had to do with either during the ECRI routine or the beginning or the end, the transition time in between, because those are can be hotbeds of some behavior that slows down instruction. All the parts of the plan, as we introduced it, they had an application activity to customize the content for that cultural and contextual fit. We found mostly our examples were spot on for ECRI, and most of them used them, but there were opportunities throughout to make it match. And this also gave the other advantage of this is it's a very short document that really outlined everything that we were asking for them to do in the study. Okay. So in this case, they had an opportunity to take a look at the matrix, change it to their own. I know one example was like eyes on the speaker, during ECRI. One teacher always said, keep your eyes on the action. So she could go in and just change it to eyes on the action instead of keep your eyes on the board. Okay. So we gave them they had a Google folder with all of the things that they could change. Brandy loves sliding things in. Tracy likes them to come right up, so I'm clicking fast. All right. So we got to the point where they had done these three things. They had the matrix, they had the examples, and then we would just, are you done? And then we would lead into the teaching and provided them that template. We did more than that. As Mike showed you, we provided them a very generic lesson with the content in it that they could revise. Sometimes I find it's a lot easier to revise something than just start from blank. Okay, so again, this was the example for ECRI, and then they could go in and change those slides. This was the most fun for everyone, where they could go in and make them look like this. So these are examples from some of the schools that we worked with. Take a second to just kind of peek at those, just like they put in their mascots. Some of them added icons for, when we presented these, the gray was really for the teacher prompts of what to say or have kids do, because you're not going to review exactly the same way every day throughout the whole school year, but some people put icons in so that the kids would see them as well. Give a wave if your schools you work at or coach have similar slides for teaching expectations, class-wide expectations, or right down to particular instructional times of the day. I'm seeing mouthing class-wide. Okay. All right. Game, again, emphasis for the game is it's something quick. It's not, we'll take half of Friday off and just go outside. It's not, we'll have pizza tomorrow in our classroom, and the teacher doesn't get a lunch break. Quick, simple, in real time types of celebrations. Okay, prompting and monitoring was, Brandy might know exactly, but data kind of shows that there is almost no prompting if you actually count rates of prompting for teachers. Sometimes we'll say something that sounds like a prompt, but it happened after a behavior error, so then it's not a prompt, it's a correction. So we really did emphasize this, that and we emphasize that quite, I'll get to the coaching part, we actually emphasize that a lot in coaching, where we would look for places like, if you had, taken those few seconds for the prompt, you may have avoided an error that we saw later, or you'd get less of them. So we really tried to focus on this a little bit more heavily. And again, there was more to go with that. Okay, specific feedback. This was one where we really did emphasize, you're not going to, hopefully, you're not going to find a teacher that says they don't praise students. But really trying to reach that effective ratio is challenging, even when, I've coached and a teacher specifically asked me to count that. They know I'm counting that for them. They asked me to count that for them. And it's really hard to, sometimes it's like 50-50, right, to, 4 to 4 in terms of specific praise versus correction statements, okay? If you can engage students, you'll boost the rates in the room. Okay, gave examples, definitions, okay? And again, that instruction, we also call that, using an instructional tone for both. If you're correcting, it's still a learning mistake or something that's not mastered or something that's not generalized to as many circumstances as we'd like. So you would let them know what they did do and what they should do instead. Again, these are integrated into the script. ECRI, I didn't see a lot of hands for knowledge of ECRI. ECRI routines do have that scripted language of what the cues are, again, so that the routine is so familiar that the cognitive load is just focused on the content. So we just added to also include the behavior content. We could only give examples, right? Because what you're going to say depends. You're not going to say great respectful listening if everybody was talking while you were doing it. So we made that real distinction that when you're doing just the reading script, you pretty much could just read everything that's on there and move on. But now this was where you had to respond based on what you were seeing. But our awesome doc students gave many examples that got integrated into the script. Again, they had an opportunity to change some of that language. Mostly, they kind of went with, they could either jot some notes into their script directly or into their plan. And then honestly, even if they just read what we had, it was still going to have more behavior instructional content than it would if they didn't have that script. I actually did videotape a teacher once who said, you know, it was respectful listening, and so for our second script we said, oh, let's add a little more variety right in what our examples are, because I found someone who actually read it all the way through, which was very exciting. We love to see the script in their hands. Right. Mike mentioned the game. Familiar with student-teacher game? Yes? Hands? No? Yes? Okay. That is something you can also download at PBIS.org. We got permission, actually Brandy got permission to make an ECRI version for us to share with our teams. It's a one-pager. If you aren't familiar with it, it really is just a very easy classroom acknowledgement tool to use, because you can use it for any subject, anytime. You can change up what you're using it for. You know, I don't have time for that, right? Sometimes we have these great creative ideas for classroom systems, but they're just unwieldy in terms of trying to just be able to do as often as we would like teachers to do it. So this is really handy. It's basically just you set up what you're looking for. It could be today, you know, during ECRI, I'm really focused on everybody waiting for my finger to slide before they say something. So all of our team points, you know, our goal is 5 points by the end of our ECRI lesson, and I'm really going to be giving the points for waiting for my slide today, right? I could do it for that center, right? I gave you the example at the beginning for the centers. That's another way you could use it. It's fun, the kids like it. There are options for, if there's student errors, the teacher gets a point. I generally like it better without the teacher points anyway, especially for younger children. Sometimes when you get more into like the 4th, 5th, and higher, then it is more of a friendly competition with the teacher. The other reason to use that cautiously is that it lets the focus go to those errors, and then we might kind of kill our ratio, right? So for the study purposes, we said only student points, set a goal for the day, which you saw in the slides. So that's a handy one to download if you don't have it. You being my timekeeper, because I'm not looking. Or how are we? Okay. Okay. And then it had the game in there. They get prompted to mention the points after every routine, because what you don't want is to go all through all 10 and then you forgot about the game entirely, although most students will remind you if you're supposed to be giving them points. But we remind them at the end of each routine. That way it's frequent. And they just, I mean, literally as they're clicking to the next slide, they walk over to where they're tallying the points and say, that's awesome. Everyone did wait for my signal on that one. We've got a game point. We only need 2 more, whatever. It takes moments. All right, we very explicitly just compared what we were looking for in the what we called standard ECRI versus integrated, and how they're different. Okay, very standardized language in the ECRI. We did not take that out, but the behavior language is not going to be as standardized, because obviously behavior is contingent, and our response to behavior is going to be contingent on what we just saw. Okay, then we really included time, well, a couple things. Those slides were customized by the time they left our 4-hour training. We gave them, the teams, that good chunk of time to make those cool mascot slides, change the language. We had to do that for our own purposes too, because we as a team were going to copy and paste them into all their daily ECRI lessons for, you know, the rest of the year. But it was really important to give them the time to make their own materials, not say, hey, you could customize this, you know, and then they go back to the, you know, the slam of day-to-day life and they don't get done. So they had fun with that. And then the other was to let them actually practice full lessons, again, still within that 4 hours. Okay. We did have 2 additional trainings that were virtual. The initial training was in person, thank goodness, because it was so much better to be right there with them, and all the activity times were much more purposeful with us able to be in the room. And then we had a winter 2-hour virtual, like one of those early release PD days. I don't know if you all have those, but And we talked a little bit more about the science of behavior. Brandy led that one, just to give the basics of what are those, the functions, and how does that affect how we respond to things? How can our responses actually do the opposite of what we want? We actually make a behavior more likely when we're trying to decrease it, which everybody in here, I'm sure, can nod widely from all the hands I saw go up. And then in the spring, we looked at data, looked at the types of things that we were seeing with the coaching and with some of the data, and really wanted to dive deeper into the specific praise, as well as strategic use of the prompts and the praise, using praise data. At that point, now we knew them pretty well. Coaches were really cautious about, oh, we can't give them graphs. It's, we're checking up with them, and it'll be evaluative, and so viable, very realistic concerns. So now we had those coaching relationships established. Teachers knew that we were going to be doing it. We talked about it at the end of the winter training, so that by the time they got their data, they knew it was coming and what it was for, and it really actually went pretty smoothly. I didn't hear a lot of negative feedback on that. The other nice thing was by spring, we also had some classroom videos from actual study classrooms with permission, but it was really great for them to see, their own colleagues in real time doing this work. Okay, so coaching, so those were training events, and in between them all was the coaching to connect the content. Okay, this is what we shared with the schools about what the coaching would be like. All right, can you see this in the back? Okay, so I won't read this, it's all to you. All right, but the idea was to really increase and maintain effective use of those strategies, right? There wasn't anyone who hadn't heard about specific feedback, even if they were right out of their college program in their first teaching job. They certainly weren't stunned to hear about praise and specific feedback. But again, that level that's really going to give you the best bang for your buck, as well as how to differentiate your use of it, even in Tier 1, right? You'll have students, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but you have, all students benefit. Some need a bit more, maybe more personalized, more direct, more often, and then a few may have individual needs, different cues and supports, so that everybody can be successful in this Tier 1 instruction. Okay. We did let them know that we might have data, and again, we always emphasize that the information between the coach and the teacher was simply from the coach to the teacher. It wasn't going anywhere else. And that purpose was to be supportive. They actually, I was one of the ones who was a little worried that there'd be a lot of pushback, honestly, on telling them their praise rate. But then we would also tally it in coaching visits, and they were like, "How did I do?" They were motivated and excited to do it. Okay. Interesting for the coaches is and I think this was key, was that we didn't have a coach for the behavior pieces and a coach for the reading pieces, okay? The coaches were integrated as well. I'm a PBIS person, by many years of trade, but I also taught first grade for a long time. I think almost all the coaches I know, taught at some point, so it's not that it's completely foreign. Any coach, certainly literacy coaches, are helping teachers with classroom management when that's getting in the way of instruction just intuitively. So it's not that these were two camps that had no idea what the other one was doing. But again, for the coaches, the behavior pieces, it's all about really having more depth of knowledge on how to use them the most effectively and regularly and differentiated for students who need more support. So that was pretty cool. I actually get ECRI questions now, gotta say. Second year, first year, what we did is we just had the coaches would participate along with the teachers in the training, and ECRI training was first because these schools weren't already using ECRI. And then I just clutched my manuals, and interestingly, among the coaches, we had a couple of us who had more of the behavior depth of knowledge, And then the rest, since I work for Hill for Literacy, guess what? They're literacy people. But that was great, so that when we had questions, they could reach out to us for behavior. We reached out to our reading, depth of knowledge people for ECRI questions. And now I field the ECRI questions, which I'm very proud of. Coaches, so we really had to support, coaches were supporting the teachers. We had the team supporting the coaches, again, so that everybody felt comfortable in that. And also, it's good practice anyway, but to have that consistency of coaching across schools is really important when it's a study. And certainly when the big ideas here of district implementation and all schools, a common culture across a district is the session I was just in. That would also help. So supporting coaches to have a consistency across themselves. Common tools for the coaching, which I'll show you in a minute. And then the coaches, like I said, participated in the teacher training and then had definitely a lot of support from the central team on data, consistent messaging to the teachers, and then the reading, and then those awesome materials. Okay. All right, common tools. This is just an outline of those reading routines with what we'd be looking for, and we just added behavior content to it. On the right is a slide from the training about getting a praise rate graph. This is some color coding. The green, if it's shaded green, it means the coach saw it. Yellow is a watch for it. And then they would have some comments at the end. And all I wanted to point out here is that we'd have a behavior support focus area. We were always working on, and it was always in the context of ECRI. And then the comments would include both. Okay, great job prompting exactly what you wanted to see. You added more specific praise, both with individual students and the whole class. Students responded and did a good job. Nice job with L. He's doing much better. So in that one sentence, you have an individual coaching feedback on individual student support within that Tier 1 routine, and then also the behavior of increasing the praise. Okay. We also added, so then when we had sort of taught those ABCs of behavior, we have the coaching, email reminders and modeling for it, and then the specific feedback. This is just an example of an email, one of the emails. So those came out from the research team and went to every teacher. We would prompt them. In this case, this was after, as you can see, well, maybe you can't, definitely you can't see in the back. This was right after Christmas break. So we reminded them to reteach full expectations. We had one set of slides, which was for the initial teaching of expectations during ECRI, and that would be the one that you would pull out periodically after long weekends or when behavior was sliding, and along with daily prompt slides. Right, this is just an example of specific feedback. Did I have this or did you pop this in? No? Okay. So baseline, we had data on praise rates before we added the integrated condition and then after. And Mike will talk a little bit about how that went as well. But you can see that in the targeted professional development, it went up. Okay. Again, I mentioned strategically, so we really spent time in that second end in our coaching around intentionally planning praise for a different subset of students. Okay. Really important second bullet, it's been one of my favorites since I did PBIS work, is when they do the expected behavior right next after you've corrected them, praise them for it. Don't ignore it. That's, you're going to get it more. So catch that. Okay. Again, differentiated rates of praise. Had a teacher who was excellent at, she was using the student teacher game. She also they had class, I think they were called like Gator Greens little tickets. She had those in her pocket, and she was seamlessly recognizing one student who had an individualized behavior plan, and he was getting verbal praise and a ticket. Other students also would get a ticket. They got the team points, the specific praise to go with it, And she just seamlessly moved between praising individual students, the whole group, or a few. Okay, we had common coaching, I shouldn't say had because we're using them now. We have common coaching agendas and performance feedback, okay. We, on the right is the agenda, and we even put an example in there of how to tally for teachers in real time so that coaches didn't have to say, I don't know how to figure out their ratio. We just explicitly taught that for coaches up front too. And again, the teachers would really look for that feedback. And now it's back to Mike for the exciting.
Don't build it up too much. So I think what's really exciting about this is, for me, is that none of these are new things, right? We know about what effective reading practice looks like. We know what effective behavior practice looks like. We also know what effective professional development and professional learning looks like, and we know what good coaching looks like. The idea here was to take that and integrate it in a way where we're doing that for both behavior supports and reading supports at the same time. And you know, so being able to kind of have these integrated practices and these integrated professional development and coaching systems was the part of this that we were really excited about. And so I'm going to share with you just a little bit about some initial data. So we were able to work with quite a few schools and teachers from across a couple of districts. And we randomly assigned at the teacher level to either do reading only or reading plus behavior. So we're really isolating the sort of added value effects of integrating the behavior supports within the reading intervention, reading instruction. One of the things that I think is really important about this is that the grant was funded before the pandemic, and then we were recruiting right around the pandemic. And so these are schools and districts that kind of came on after the pandemic. And what we really realized is we had to focus on areas that were top priorities for them as schools. And I think it's a testament to the importance of this, that our schools really were all in for doing this support for early reading and support for behavior. So every classroom teacher in every one of these schools that participated was part of the study. And it was because principals supported this, it was because district folks supported this, so we were able to randomly assign teachers in each of these schools to those two conditions. So we collected measures on teacher practices and student behavior, as well as student reading outcomes. So we had a very kind of complex classroom observation system where we looked at teacher behaviors, and we also looked at student behaviors, and then we collected DIBELS data from the schools for looking at reading outcomes. So I'm going to be able to talk to you a little bit about the behavior data. But let me talk about fidelity first, because I think this is really interesting. Also, there are a couple of new slides in here that I put in, which we will update just because I can't not stop tinkering with the slides until the very last minute. So our questions for fidelity were, can teachers implement evidence-based Tier 1 reading instruction with fidelity? They can. We know that. That's good. Do teachers integrate effective behavior practices into evidence-based reading instruction? No, they don't. Right? So we had a fidelity measure that captured both the elements of the reading instruction and the effective behavior supports. And what we found is they both did the reading because they all got reading support, but the teachers that were just doing the reading only didn't do behavior praise, didn't prompt for behavior, didn't do this sort of positive reinforcement. Right? So it's sort of interesting that it kind of proved the point of why we're doing this in the first place, and kind of what Tracy said. If you're not providing direct support or instruction to teachers on what you want them to do, you might not see it. We were sort of worried because a lot of things that you say is like, oh, if you're doing good reading instruction, it's going to happen automatically. Teachers that know about this stuff will build it in. We'll build all those kind of behaviors in, and we didn't see that. But what we did see is when we provided the kind of professional development and coaching that Tracy talked about, they were able to do both have high fidelity on the reading instruction and also have high fidelity on the behavior practices. This is sort of we're not sure exactly about this, but we did, almost the reading fidelity seemed like it could have been even a little higher in the teachers that were doing the integrated behavior and reading. So what did we find? Positive differences in effective teaching and student behaviors. This is just the first cohort. So large increase in teacher prompts and specific praise, and a decrease in teacher general negative statements. And we also are finding increased student behaviors time engaged with reading instruction and decreases in off-task behaviors. So we're seeing, and if you like effect sizes, here's some effect sizes. But again, what we found is that we can help teachers incorporate and integrate these effective behavior practices into effective reading instruction when we kind of build the supports into the practices themselves and when we provide integrated systems support through professional development and through coaching. So we're pretty excited about this. We don't have the reading outcomes yet, but the feedback from the districts has been that they were really happy about how their reading outcomes were looking. And in fact, they signed on a bunch of their schools for the following year. So we have our fingers crossed for the reading data. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Brandy for the wrap up. And then.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to just take a couple of this, and I keep wanting to walk over there, but I'm supposed to stand over here for the video. So the effect size piece, how many of you are researchers and know what these mean? Some of you. So those of you who know what these mean know that 2 is like astronomically high. So effect size gives us that indicator of how powerful or meaningful a difference is. So these are really big effects. Some of these are smaller, but this is a tier 1 30-minute intervention. So Mike reminds me that when we're looking at tier 1 and all students, even slightly smaller effect sizes are really powerful. Most of our research in school-wide has similar effect sizes when we're looking at the differences for all kids, because where we see the biggest impact is for kids who have the most room to grow. So when I'm looking at this, one of my takeaways is, what does this mean for me, right? As an educator, as someone who trains and does this work. And I don't know about y'all, but when I have coached PBIS, kind of the whole framework or even a specific practice, we often put a lot on teachers to remember how to do this, and we ask them to think about ways to support their instruction. So if they're teaching behavior, we ask them to have lesson plans. But for all of the practices that they're supposed to embed in instruction, prompts and praise, we ask them to remember to do it. And in a lot of my research, we do things like hand them a golf counter, and we say, hey, for 15 minutes, really focus on if you're doing it and count. So you're holding yourself accountable, and we have them set goals and celebrate and all of these things. In this study, and Tracy mentioned this, we did performance feedback once a month. So that may have been part of the active ingredient. They got fidelity feedback twice a month. But the biggest, I think, difference here is that we gave them scripted materials. They had reminders in front of them, so it wasn't just that they had to remember and maybe track whether they were doing it. They actually had them proactively. So not all of you are going to be able to go into materials the same way we did because we had a research study, but all of our teachers, or many of our teachers, use Google Slides, or they use some kind of an instructional material. You can have them think about, similarly, creating slides that they're going to embed throughout their instruction throughout the day. I walked into our elementary school with our Dutch colleagues who are here visiting, and it was an art classroom. And up on the board, with no prompting, she had how the expectations were connecting to the art habits she was working on for the students. So she had it embedded in her slide so she would remember to make those connections. So thinking about how we can help teachers, Susan Barrett always uses the term script the moves, how we can help them literally script their moves embedded in their classroom instruction sets them up for success, I think, in ways that often we don't do in PBIS. And the integrated coaching and training is also a game changer. Like, how awesome would it be if every single time an academic curriculum was rolled out, we explicitly taught what it was to prompt, teach, and reinforce the school-wide and classroom expectations in that training. So it's actually embedded and integrated in the training. The coaches go in and they do integrated coaching. I see some schools doing that already, but I think we have a lot of room to grow in the field on what it means to integrate. So I'm going to just remind you, we have resources on PBIS.org around what MTSS looks like in the classroom. It's heavier on the behavior side, but some of the practices are shown there. The other exciting resource is this research network was funded before the pandemic, so we have been on pause, and we are coming off of pause in the last few years. But we have developed some briefs, and we will continue to do so, that are 2 pages. So we are holding ourselves accountable to only 2-page briefs, which in the Center on PBIS, we're famous for writing longs instead of briefs. So these are each 2 pages. They talk about the history of MTSS and the triangle. Lucille mentioned that this morning. I think, and I was really excited about this, I think we actually found like the very first triangle that was in print after many conversations and digging, so there's a screenshot of it. There's resources on the definition, the history of the language, and we'll continue to develop some on the evidence, what we know and a lot of what we don't know, and some of how it's being implemented. So we wanted to have longer time for Q&A, but we also wanted to share a lot with you. Feel free to send us an email. And before you go, please do the quick QR code and give feedback, because this, as you all know, data guides our decisions about future forum sessions and future forum content. So we'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to ask you to have an awesome lunch. Come back. Also, if this is your first time and I see a lot of familiar faces, make sure you come to the poster session. It's like a science fair for grown-ups, and there are snacks, and it is a wonderful time to connect. So have a great lunch, have a great rest of your day. We'll see you later.